Well, hello, everyone. All you beautiful faces out there in the Zoom mundo. Buenas noches, everyone, and welcome to City Lights Live. This is a City Lights Books event series that celebrates authors, poets, revolutionaries, and other beloved assorted rebel rousers out there. Once upon a time, this series used to happen upstairs in City Lights Poetry Room, but now since the pandemic, we have made the transition to the Zoom mundo. And tonight, as always, we are broadcasting from unceded Ramaytush and Ohlone territories. If you're in La Bahia, take a moment, say hello to the Ohlone and Ramaytush spirits next to you. Thank them for being here. Tonight, we're so feliz and excited to be presenting Kyle T. Mays in conversation with Paul Ortiz, celebrating the release of Kyle's new book, An Afro-Indigenous History of the United States. Yes. The first intersectional history of the Black and Native American struggle for freedom in the US. It performs a great service in exploring and reframing our understanding of who was Indigenous in early America. Yeah, a couple of quick reminders, quick and friendly reminders before we get started. For those of you that don't know, City Lights Books has now been open for regular business hours for a while now. We're open 7 days a week, 12 to 8. Masks are required while you're in the store. So if you haven't come by to see us lately, and if you are in the Bay Area, what are you waiting for? Stop by, please. And I mean this with all sincerity. The bookstore has missed you for real. And remember, good people, City Lights is not just a bookstore. We are also a publishing house with a long, beautiful list of books we've published. We're really proud of some of our new releases, such as San Francisco Poet Laureate Tongo Eisen Martin's new book of poetry, Blood on the Fog. Is the kind of book you could throw at a tank and it would explode. I kid you not. And we're also very, very proud to be releasing a 50th anniversary edition of our beloved poet Diana Prima's Revolutionary Letters. So yeah, these are two amazing books City Lights has put out recently. Check them out. And also keep your eyes out in spring 2022. City Lights, oh, I'm so excited about this. City Lights is publishing D.S. Marius' new poetry collection, Before Whiteness, as well as Clarence Lusain's 20 and Change, Harriet Tubman versus Andrew Jackson and the Future of American Democracy. So keep your eyes out for those. During the conversation tonight between Kyle and Paul, we're going to be posting links with which you can purchase Kyle's new book in the chat function. Por favor, people, please consider purchasing this book, because it goes without saying it's a great way to support the author as well as the bookstore. And finally, there's going to be a Q&A at the end of this talk between Paul and Kyle. So if you have any burning questions for either one of them, por favor, post them in the chat function and we'll do our best to get to your questions at the end of the convo. All right, now without one more little thing, and we'll get on with our event tonight, let me first introduce our very two special guests for the evening. Kyle T. Mays is an Afro-Indigenous Saginaw Chippewa writer and scholar of U.S. history, urban studies, race relations, and contemporary popular culture. Kyle is an assistant professor of African American Studies, American Indian Studies, and History at the University of Califas, California, Los Angeles. He's the author of Hip Hop Beats, Indigenous Rhymes, Modernity and Hip Hop in Indigenous North America. Yeah, and joining Kyle in conversation tonight is Paul Ortiz. Paul is an award-winning author and professor of history at the University of Florida, where he teaches undergraduate courses and supervises graduate fields in African American history, Latina and Latino and Latinx history, comparative ethnic studies, and many, many other topics. Paul is the author of An African American and Latinx History of the United States, which received the 2018 PEN Oakland-Josephine Miles Award for Literary Excellence. His book, Emancipation Betrayed, The Hidden History of Black Organizing and White Violence in Florida from Reconstruction to the Bloody Election of 1920, was awarded the Harry T. and the Harriet V. Moore Book Prize from the Florida Historical Society and the Florida Institute of Technology. Now, people, por favorcito, give a warm Zoom Mundo welcome to Kyle T. Mays and Paul Ortiz.
Thank you. Thank you for the wonderful introduction. And I see a lot of like familiar folks on here, family, friends. Shout out to my homie, longtime friend, Dr. Bryce Henson on here. I saw the name and a few other folks. I just scroll all the way through. So, and thank you, Josiah, for that wonderful introduction. And thank you, Paul, a historian I certainly admire, look up to. Spoke to before I even tried to approach my own book. So whether any faults of the book are certainly my own, but I certainly tried to model and do the best that I could after someone like a fantastic historian like Paul Ortiz. So tonight, and again, thank you all for coming. East Coast, West Coast, Midwest, very much appreciated. And so tonight, what I'm going to do is read some excerpts. Paul and I are going to engage in some Q&A, and hopefully we have time for questions from you all. And so by way of that, I'm really going to just start off with an introduction, and then I'll read an excerpt from the author's note, which hopefully will help you get to know me better and why I decided to write the book. All right. So as mentioned, I'm currently an assistant professor in African Studies, American Studies, and History at UCLA. I've been thinking and dreaming of doing this project since I ordered a book from the Evil Empire of Amazon. So I was young, and I finally learned now not to do this. This was 2008, and I ordered a book on Detroit's Native history. And I opened to the middle of the page, and immediately I saw my Aunt Judy Mays on the page. It's like a full black and white photo. And so I called her and I go, Aunt Judy, you know you're in a book, right? And she just kind of said, yeah, I know. And from there, it was very important to me to write about Native, Indigenous peoples, African American peoples around Detroit, and their particular experiences growing up and hearing stories about back in the day in the 60s and 70s. And I also wanted to know more. A lot of these stories, which I'll get into in a little bit, are dominated by the 5 tribes, by histories of enslavement and dispossession in the southeastern United States and the Trail of Tears going to Indian country, present-day Oklahoma, which of course is very important, but it's a limited understanding. That was never my family's experience. And the tribal nations, in the Midwest, and also other communities on the Northeast who often get erased even today in national discussions around who's Indigenous and other discourse around Native peoples. So I'm just going to read the author's note from the book. I'm writing this book for at least 3 reasons. First, because of my personal identity. I am Black and Saginaw Chippewa. Second, if I have to imagine a new world, one that brings an end to a world that hates Black people and reproduces anti-Blackness and white supremacy, in a world that erases Indigenous people and reproduces their dispossession through settler colonialism, I intend to tell some histories that have been ignored at best or made invisible at worst. Third, there's a deeply intellectual component rooted in my interactions in graduate school. So I graduated from the University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign. When I visited a prospective graduate school, I met with an infamous Black Studies professor in his office. When I told him that I was interested in doing research on the links between the American Indian movement and the Black Panther Party, and for you folks, I might still do that project, so please don't plagiarize that, he scoffed, saying, "There's no relationship." Beyond the fact that he was at worst lying and at best very misinformed, I believe he knew some of these histories, but because of his hotepness, he didn't want to discuss the importance of Black and Indigenous solidarity. And hotep is like a social media term from my generation and below. And when I'm using this, I mean a hyper masculine Black male who has an ahistorical Afrocentric conception of themselves, refers to men and women as kings and queens, and basks in their alleged connection to ancient Africa and all of its glory. And I think there's some merit to that, but not to the patriarchal stuff behind that. He had no basis for that claim. I was also upset that he so easily dismissed my research idea. However, since that time, I've learned that Black and Indigenous people continue to produce similar responses as a Black studies professor. As an Afro-Indigenous person, I also know that there's a crucial need for a book that considers the history of Afro-Indigenous struggles, their interactions throughout US history, and how that particular relationship is a foundation for our new sphere of freedom. For me, it is essential that I include Black and Indigenous people in our collective understanding of liberation. And I should say all other oppressed groups as well, but just for the focus of the book here. I want to recover some lost histories to show that Black and Indigenous people's histories are tied not only to enslavement and dispossession, but also a struggle for justice. The journey has entailed many diverse challenges, all while Black and Indigenous peoples have sought belonging and freedom in a country that continues to say, we don't want you. How does one begin to write a large book on the topic of intersecting Black American and Native American cultures, histories, and peoples? As a Black and Saginaw Anishinaabe person from Michigan, I began with my own story. My mom is Black American and was raised in Cleveland, Ohio. She is a descendant of enslaved people from South Carolina on her father's side. Her grandmother came to Cleveland, Ohio in the mid-1930s from Fayetteville, Georgia. My dad is Black and Saginaw Anishinaabe, raised in Detroit and Lansing, Michigan. His grandmother, my great-grandmother, Esther Chabus, or her Indian name was Keadnokwe, came to Detroit in the spring of 1940 from the Saginaw Chippewa reservation. She married a Black American man, Robert Isaiah Mays, and his family is from the Tennessee area. They produced 9 Afro-Indigenous children. Her children were very active in both Detroit's Black and Indigenous community struggles from the 1960s through the early 2000s. This activism culminated in my Aunt Judy Mays founding the Medicine Bear American Indian Academy, a Detroit public school with an all Native American curriculum designed for Black and Indigenous as well as Latinx students in the city. Medicine Bear was the 3rd public school in the US that had been created with the Native American curriculum. Importantly, the school would not have been created without the advocacy of Black politicians in the city. So I come from 2 different communities. However, I would be remiss not to acknowledge that my Black ancestors came from Indigenous peoples as well. I don't know the particular tribe or nation. That information was lost because of slavery. I know about the Indigenous heritage of only part of myself. While it might be impossible to find out my personal African Indigenous heritage, I can at least acknowledge a larger history of Indigenous Africans, my own heritage. When I travel the country to discuss my research, I often get 2 versions of a comment or question about identity. First, a person of Black American ancestry might share that they have Cherokee blood in them, maybe Blackfeet. Or someone, usually a young person, will ask me how I deal with being both Black and Indigenous. I tell them that for me, it wasn't a contradiction being Black and Indigenous, while others question me, my family didn't question or police my own identity. In documenting encounters between Black and Indigenous peoples, I have focused the majority of my examples in this book in unexpected ways and places. In fact, the whole book could be considered unexpected. On the one hand, I challenge the very notion of what we know about these relationships. I'm only mildly interested in writing about the relationship between, for example, the 5 tribes and enslaved Africans, though I'm sure that's what many will expect. The topic of enslavement and dispossession in the 19th century dominates the books on African Americans and Native Americans. However, if we are to build a shared Afro-Indigenous future on stolen Indigenous land and recover roots of the ancestors of stolen Indigenous Africans, then it will require we find underexplored histories, rethink accepted histories, and survey solidarities and tensions, and also imagine how the world might look like after white supremacy and settler colonialism have been dismantled. So that is the part of the author's note that I shared with you to give a better understanding. And one reason I decided to write the book, I often think of my nieces and nephews, or especially young Afro-Indigenous children who are often told to choose one identity over the other instead of being able to embrace their full selves as humans. And you can be both Afro-Indigenous at the same time. So I'm going to read another section on the Black and Red Power movement. Because within that scholarship, often there's a whole, and I mentioned very briefly my interactions with the Black Studies professor who said that they had no relationship. And of course, folks on the ground would differ. So whether you're reading the Black Panther Party's intercommunal news service, they documented Native people's actions very often, or what I call looking through Black history and these interactions through the lens of the great Standing Rock Sioux writer and intellectual Vine Deloria Jr. So he has a book called Custer Died for Your Sins, an Indian Manifesto, published originally in 1969. And he has a chapter called The Red and the Black. And he essentially argues that Black people have been fighting for civil rights and Native people have been fighting for treaty rights, or in other words, just to be left alone. And in that formulation, it ignores a lot of Black radicals who have tried to find freedom and solidarity, who either wanted to leave the United States altogether, right? And so when you ignore that history, it's easy how several scholars over generations have perpetuated this idea that there was very little collaboration, or that these forms of protest and activism are so vastly different, and that therefore there's no need to compare and understand them. But what I tried to do in this book, in a chapter on the Black and Red Power, was to demonstrate these connections and recover these histories that are known to some extent, but lesser known in a mainstream historical understanding. So I'm just going to read a little bit about this. In 1976, the Black scholar published a special issue titled The Third World. While the discourse of third world struggles focused on liberation efforts in Africa, Asia, and Latin America, the folks at the Black Scholar also considered how third world oppression also operated within the United States. For the third world peoples have a common history of dehumanization and oppression based on race, wrote the editors. This is what binds Afro-Americans, Mexican-Americans, Asian Americans, and Native Americans to their ancestors and relatives in distant lands. They went on to describe the specific histories of what connected these seemingly disparate socio-historical relationships. Quote, this common history of oppression began with the advent of European colonialism and its brutal accomplice, the slave system. Native Americans found their lands ruthlessly stolen and themselves decimated by enslavement and European diseases. Millions upon millions of Africans were torn from their villages, tossed into slave vessels, and transported thousands of miles to be forced to labor in mines and on plantations in the New World, end quote. They believed that unity and liberation were possible because of their shared oppression, their colonial situation. They wrote, thus, the common struggle, the struggle of the third world people inside and outside of the US for freedom and independence, is far from completed. No doubt there are many uphill battles yet to be waged, but a history of unity and oppression has laid the basis for a new unity and struggle amongst third world peoples. It is interesting that Black and radical intellectuals and activists held this belief. However, the settler state has erased our collective memories and our imagination about what might be possible. So I wrote a particular section on the discourses of Black and Red Power that I'm going to read from here. The discourse of Black and Red Power existed side by side. The phrase Black Power emerged as a rallying cry in Greenwood, Mississippi in June 1966 in a speech by Stokely Carmichael during the March Against Fear, which was organized after the shooting of James Meredith. While there were earlier iterations of Black Power, Carmichael popularized it. And they wrote his co-authored book with Charles Hamilton. The adoption of the concept of Black Power is one of the most legitimate and healthy developments in American politics and race relations in our time. It is a call for Black people in this country to unite, to recognize their heritage, to build a sense of community. Though Carmichael would later think beyond nation-state borders, he did understand that one had to have a clear sense of self before debating rights and protections from a state that was predicated on your exploitation. Native people also participated in rhetorical power games, raising a fist and utilizing the phrase red power. Though the etymology of the phrase is not entirely clear, it was most definitely an assertion of indigenous sovereignty, a declaration that Native people were there to stress to the white settler that they were reclaiming their right to sovereignty, guaranteed by their treaties. Now, here's what Deloria had to say, especially about the differences between Black civil rights, at least what he understood, and Native struggles for sovereignty. Civil rights as a movement for legal equality ended when the Blacks dug beneath the equality of fictions which white liberals had used to justify their great crusade. Black power as a communications phenomenon was a godsend to other groups. It clarified the intellectual concepts which had kept Indians and Mexicans confused and allowed the concept of self-determination suddenly to become valid. So he respected Carmichael's iteration of Black power because he was a stark critic of the civil rights movement as related to Native peoples. And finally, Black and Indigenous peoples also participate in each other's struggles for liberation. And this is me also going back to like 2009, responding to this particular professor. They showed up to each other's protests, including the takeover of the Bureau of Indian Affairs in 1972 and the occupation of Wounded Knee in 1973. In 1972, while in Washington, D.C., Pan-Africanists Stokely Carmichael showed up during the third day of the takeover of the Bureau of Indian Affairs, in which Native activists stormed the office, took it over, and retrieved thousands of documents related to tribal issues. Carmichael, speaking as the head of the All-African People's Revolutionary Party, which certainly were in solidarity and continue to this day to be in solidarity with worldwide indigenous struggles. So they offered to support this movement 100%. The question of Native Americans is not just a question of civil rights, he said. This land is their land, and we have agreed to do whatever we can to provide help. There can be no settlement until their land is returned to them. And why I am so drawn in this book and in other writings to the legacy and rhetoric of Stokely Carmichael, who had changed his name to Kwame Ture, is because he was one of the core Black radicals who plainly said, this is not our land, this is Native people's land. And therefore, what can we do to further that particular struggle and end the occupation of the United States as a settler democracy, right? And that is a unique thing, especially during that time period. And I use that also to say to present activists, thinkers who want more justice, more rights, more freedom, more liberation, or even reparations, which I do question why you want reparations under this particular capitalist system. But how can we talk about the returning of land to indigenous peoples? And that's where I'm trying to push towards and finding some form of solidarity. And Paul, I'm gonna read one last section, and then hopefully we can have some Q&A. I'm gonna go towards the conclusion here. So in the book, I try to demonstrate the history of the United States through the lens of Afro-Indigenous histories, relationships, and people. And I tried to show the relationship between settler colonialism and white supremacy, which has been a defining feature of the United States, and that these political material categories continue to shape our everyday lives. I want to end with a note, if you will, on why Black and Indigenous peoples need each other. In particular, we need to come together to liberate ourselves, all of us. However, I must say I often feel vexed as a Black and Indigenous person when this topic comes up. I'm forced to choose between being Black or Indigenous, but not both. I do believe that there is a natural possibility of a coalition between Black and Indigenous communities. Although they are different, that difference does not mean that they cannot come together for radical transformation. I now want to turn to the Black lesbian feminist Audre Lorde to frame my thoughts and also offer some advice with love. We can't assume that our coalition based on survival and care for our future will be easy. As Lorde notes in her essay, Learning from the 60s, any future vision which can encompass all of us, by definition, must be complex and expanding, not easy to achieve. This quote should remind us that we will not figure things out right away. Liberation takes work. It takes compassion, love, and patience. It requires that we embrace our differences. To achieve such unity, again, returning to Lorde, it implies the coming together of elements which are, to begin with, varied and diverse in their particular natures. I think we clearly recognize the differences among each other. We fight over who has it worse, Blacks or Indigenous peoples. We talk emphatically that defining feature of Indigenous peoples is the treaty relationship, which is true, but don't consider similarities at all. And I'll end with this. We have work to do, but we can do it. Anti-Blackness and Indigenous dispossession have to end. So let's do it together. Thank you for listening to a few of those excerpts. And Paul, I'm looking forward to the conversation with you. Thank you.
All right. Wonderful, Professor Mays. Let's give him a round of applause. I'm so excited and thrilled about this book. I'm so honored to be here this evening with you and back in City Lights and with so many dear comrades. I can see, I don't want to call people out because I'll miss someone inevitably, but Kyle, I was blown away in reading this book, brother. I mean, I have to be serious with you. This book is exactly what I think we need for this moment in, building a sense of solidarity between oppressed peoples, but thinking beyond oppression. And one of the things that struck me in your book, and I have to say that I've read the uncorrected page proof, which I have in front of me right now, and it's so full of highlights and notes, and oh my gosh, this is so cool. Why didn't I think of this? I wrote about 29, 30 times, before I was in chapter 2. But I wanted to see if I could ask you to talk about a couple of key parts. One is you ask us to imagine Black and Indigenous struggles outside of the boundary of the nation state. And this was so amazing, and you do it so consistently. This is something that, Roxanne Dunbar Ortiz and other great writers have asked us to do. And you just do it in a really compelling manner from page 1. And I wonder if you could kind of tell us how you imagine those struggles outside of the boundaries of the nation state and why that's important.
It's odd because I'm supposed to be writing about the United States, and it was a struggle initially. You're thinking of examples, like talking about a lot of Equiano or discussing Du Bois and Charles Eastman going to London. But you realize that some of the best activists and thinkers and intellectuals certainly thought beyond the nation state. Either they wanted to really reform it and so they looked elsewhere, or they wanted to dismantle it altogether and radically transform society. So some people decided to leave, And for activists, you know, some of their greatest in the 60s and 70s, someone like Frantz Fanon, for example, from Martinique, was a huge intellectual influence for many people. And so for me to tell a story of Afro-Indigenous peoples is also to disrupt the naturalness, the embeddedness of the US nation state, right? Because if we don't do that, then we just assume we're exceptional. And I refuse to think that the US is exceptional in many regards. And it's important. It's been a core feature of Black and Indigenous radicals since before the founding of the nation state. And I think it's important to acknowledge that and respect those histories and struggles going forward.
Wonderful. You know, one of the things, Kyle, as I was reading through the book, I was thinking, you know, you have this phrase, the long 19th century, and so much of what you have to say about the 19th century in the US is really mind-blowing. I think that when people really sit down and read your book and Afro-Indigenous history of the United States, they're going to begin to have problems with the broader narrative of American exceptionalism in many ways. But I wonder if I could get you to kind of, and because I realize because of these supply chain issues, probably very few people actually, unfortunately, probably don't have your book in hand, right? We have it on order. I have mine on order, right? But you talk about resistance in some really powerful, nuanced, like new ways. And it really struck me because, you know, you can talk about, you know, in your work, and I've seen you before talk about like Frantz Fanon and people who, you know, you mentioned Kwame Ture, the Black Panthers, Young Lords, other groups which at times engaged in armed self-defense. And when we think of Native resistance or Indigenous resistance in the long 19th century against settler colonialism, I mean, I still think the first thing I think of is, well, you know, armed resistance, right? You know, warfare, the Seminole Wars in Florida, where I'm now. But you talk about resistance in so many different multifaceted ways. Could you talk about that? How you really want us to kind of rethink the concept of Black and Indigenous resistance?
Yeah, so I draw a lot on scholars like Robin D.G. Kelly and the notion of infrapolitics, and not to get too technical about that, but the everyday forms of resistance that aren't always always legible, right? So you mentioned, you know, warfare, fighting, and those sort of responses, but what are the other ways in which Black and Indigenous peoples can resist? So whether it's through writing, I try to document that through writing, through Jane Johnson Schoolcraft, and trying to challenge those sort of things. So for me, in order to understand holistically how people resist, and not all sorts of people are out on the battlefields in a certain way, because some people wanted to find a way to either get along or just simply to survive. And often violence wasn't necessarily something that they were an advocate for. And so some people try to use education. And I think we have to, even today in different forms of activism, you have to find a varied set of approaches to try to solve the issue of US empire.
I just have two more questions, and then we'll kind of transition. I'm going to help facilitate the Q&A from the chat bar. So if you have questions for Kyle Mays, please feel free to go ahead and put those in the chat bar, and we'll begin to transition to those in just a few minutes. Kyle, I'm looking at some, you know, there's so many really important concepts in this book that you either kind of reintroduce, help us rethink. There's two concepts: survivance, which you connect to Indigenous people's struggles, and belonging, which you connect to Black struggles. And I'm just going to read a brief passage and ask you to help us, you know, especially as organizers now, because I mean, I have so much respect for your work because you're very comfortable in talking about your work as scholarship, but also as organizing and struggle. You have no, I'm just so heartened and inspired by your ability to do that. And it really seems to come down to this following paragraph. And so if you'll allow me to give you a preview of your older age as you start to age, I put my reading glasses on. So you say, Native people's survival and thriving right along the continued operation of the US nation state is remarkable. They have used the law, warfare, writing, and other acts of resistance to challenge their colonial condition. As Indigenous peoples have asserted survivance, Black folks have asserted their belonging. In this way, the fact that both have survived violent forms of the US settler/white nationalist project and have attempted at times together and at other times separately to make the principles of US democracy work is remarkable. Black belonging and Indigenous survivance remain central to how they have survived and will continue to do so into the future. Talk to us about the future of belonging and survivance.
Yeah, so, and just to remind people, the core feature of US democracy are two things: Indigenous dispossession and expropriation of land, and the enslavement and exploitation of Black people, and subsequently, certainly, I mean, even during the time, but certainly other workers and poor people, right? And so for me, the future is really building on that history, because often, and increasingly I cringe when folks will say something to the effect of me continuing to live as a form of survivance and thriving. And like, no, that's not the organizational part of continuing to do work, right? And we all have different capacities and what we're trying to approach. But it really comes down to, how do we continue to demonstrate that Native people still exist? I'm sure some of y'all saw your former president doing the chop thing at the Atlanta baseball team's thing, and that's everything you need to know about how settler colonialism works. It's not just the taking of land, but the perpetuation of discourses and practices well into the present that say that Native people no longer exist. And belonging for Black people, it's about saying, you know, we may have been kidnapped, our ancestors, from our homeland, but we're going to remain here. You're not going to disappear us and continue to exploit us. And so as long as we're having these conversations in a lot of different spaces, from academia all the way to the hood, and you know, incarcerated spaces, what have you, and thinking about how we can create a sense of belonging together for all oppressed peoples, then I think that will be a beautiful thing. But we have to make sure that returning Indigenous land remains central, and whatever different Indigenous nations protocols for adopting people, incorporating people, how they engage community and kinship, even on their own lands, I think will create something in the aftermath of settler colonialism and white supremacy.
Nice, thank you, thank you. Well, let's transition to the chat bar. And I'm looking, I want to make sure I start at the first question from Kip Dawson. And she says, thank you both, and would like you each to comment on the relationship between taking on settler colonialism and the struggle to save our planet from the existential problems that get called, quote, climate change.
Yeah, I mean, it ain't climate change, that's for sure. I think, and Paul, I hope you take a stab at this too, but I think in general, we need more public discourse to say that the things that have happened to the planet are a direct product of European colonialism and imperialism. I mean, and it's continued well into the present through the US. I mean, and so when you couple that together historically and how it's existing in the present, it's colonialism. And at least in my analysis. Paul, do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think that settler colonialism teaches a range of behaviors that just really teach us to treat each other abysmally and treat the world around us abysmally. I mean, I think of the tragedy of the global pandemic in the United States and this idea that, you know, I just don't care enough about the people around me to get vaccinated or to wear a mask or to do social distancing because, you know, I'm an island unto myself. And it's that kind of pattern of behavior when we look back. And I learned so much, you know, I know as you did, Kyle, from reading Roxanne Dunbar Ortiz's work, Indigenous People's History. And I remember, you know, it was either in Roxanne's book or she drew from an earlier generation of scholarship, which talked about writers like John Locke, who I was taught to see as, you know, this great European philosopher. But from the perspective of Black and Indigenous people, John Locke is writing a war book, you know, a war manual, you know, how to dispossess people, how to fence off their property. And looking at settler colonialism, you know, I'm working on a book right now on settler colonialism, which hopefully will be published sometime this century. But I just notice in the 1700s and 1800s, Europeans who act in such, I mean, horrific ways, and they're incentivized and encouraged to do that. There's a philosophy that's building, that's saying, it reminds me something that my wife and I were in the National Museum in New Zealand, and there was a Maori historian who was trying to explain to us the trauma of settler colonialism for Indigenous peoples in New Zealand. And he was saying, you know, we never got it through the heads of Europeans that when they would show up on a piece of land and they didn't see anyone there, they would just say, well, this land is barren. It belongs to me now. And they would say, well, we never could get them to understand just because no one is there doesn't mean you can steal it, you know? And I think that that's so typical of the mindset connecting the exploitation of people with the exploitation of the environment, right?
Well stated. That's well stated.
Well, let me go down the chat. And so this one is from Bryce Henson. Can Dr. Mays, Dr. Ortiz speak to the broader implications of connecting marginalized people's struggles and freedom dreams together rather than as separate issues?
Well, I think the first thing when you do that, you understand that your particular issue isn't always as unique as you think. When one oppressed group realizes, oh, capitalism has been negative for many of us, that's not a good thing, or we're all exploited workers in some capacity. And so I think when those things sort of happen, it creates broader connections, but often this requires people to sit down and communicate with each other, right? Like one of my dreams is to get Black and Indigenous elders, multi-generational, sit down over some food. We can have Indian tacos. We can get some gluten-free Indian tacos, whatever people want to do. And really talk. I think food is a great connector and talk about particular issues. And certainly not over social media, because that ain't gonna save nobody. But you know, outside of a pandemic world, and really engage in conversations about what we want for our shared futures, and not always responding, you know, to issues, whether it's police brutality or reproductive rights, not always responding to certain things, but like literally building while we're having to struggle in the day. And as you said, Dr. Henson, dreaming of freedom thereafter. I think you have to build and dream at the same time.
Yeah. I mean, I think just to echo what you're saying, Kyle, one of the exciting things to see is, especially in the wake of the Black Lives Matter movement, and the Black Lives Matter movement, I think, has really pushed people in this country and other countries to really look at themselves in the mirror much more clearly, to look at their own national histories. You know, I have former students in Nigeria and in China and other parts of the world who have organized Black Lives Matter protests in their, where they're at, you know, whether it's in Lagos, Johannesburg, Taipei, other places, I mean, all over the world. But the key thing about the Black Lives Matter movement is this reckoning with history, and a new kind of history where struggles for justice are connected to each other, and instead of being distinct and separate. And I guess what I mean by this is that, you know, the two busiest months of the year for me have traditionally been his so-called Hispanic Heritage Month, which we're just coming out of, and Black History Month. And increasingly those months, Kyle, are coming together. I know you've seen this also, so that almost every Hispanic Heritage Month that I engaged in this year, whether it was with like a Chicano community organization in Los Angeles, or a Puerto Rican, you know, labor union in South Chicago, or something in the Bronx or Miami, almost every one of them asked me, you know, Professor Ortiz, in talking about Hispanic Heritage Month, can you make sure and bring Black history and put that at the center? And can you especially talk about anti-Black racism in Latino or Chicano or, you know, Puerto Rican communities? And the same is true increasing with Black History Month, you know, people asking us to talk about other struggles outside of Black history, right? It's happening.
Yeah, I mean, it's really important to do and to think about how they intersect, collaborated, talk through what are perceived differences. But it forces people to talk about larger structural issues. In good old 1990s Bill Clinton America, all the multiculturalism, yada, 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 like focuses so much on the individual instead of what I always appreciate about the 60s. And I'm starting to sound like an old head at some point, but like they really talked about structures in a certain way that I'm seeing, certainly since the Black Lives Matter movement, it's become a renewed source of energy around how people are discussing issues. So I'm very grateful for that going forward, which is why you can see solidarity.
Exactly. Going down the chat bar, Kyle, it says thrivance. That's a word I haven't seen in a long time. It's a great word, thrivance. And then, do they want all the land? The Indians.
Interesting question. So in South Africa, just a few years ago, the indigenous South Africans, you know, South Africa is a settler colony like the US. And the Dutch went to colonize. They'd been there for a while, created the apartheid system, and they were a minority, unlike here in the US. And the indigenous South Africans were saying, yeah, we want our land back. And so there was a whole, like, the white South Africans were tripping about like people who own land, and some people had to flee. And they're like, well, we've been living here. No, you live on stolen land. I don't know how else to put that. And if you were to be on the right side of history, I would say respect indigenous sovereignty. And if that time comes, which I hope it would, that Native peoples can live on their own land. I would love to see that. I'm a huge proponent of that. Then you should be supportive of those struggles and in that particular future that I hope we all want to see in some capacity. And as Fanon would say, colonialism was violence from the beginning. And if it's an ongoing occurrence, then it's continuing to be violent. And one of the ways to end that is to really return land to indigenous peoples.
Well, apropos of that, Kyle, so I'm seeing a new question pop up, which says a statement and a question, which connects to what you're saying about the land. So build and dream at the same time, yes. Landowners give so much land to university, and state land trusts, ideas for rectifying this. And so I think you and I, brother, kind of part of the guilty parties, right? I'm down at the University of Florida, land grant, you're UCLA. So this is kind of a practical question for us, right?
Yeah, I mean, UCLA, it's just Frederick Douglass. I come back to this. UCLA is not going to give land back to the Tonga without some real struggle. I'll just put it that way. It's millions of dollars that they're raking in surely from being, especially in an expensive real estate market like Los Angeles. So I'm rooting for that, but they're not going to do that out of the kindness and goodness of their heart. That's not how major landowners work.
Yeah. Well, one of the things, and this is not an answer in any way, shape, or form, because roughly the same situation, holds true at the University of Florida. And it's so amazing to me being in Gainesville, Florida, where, this was the epicenter of especially the Second Seminole War, which was really the bloodiest and most expensive war in US history, like up to the Civil War. But yet people, liberals, conservatives, radicals are just incredibly, they don't know. I mean, even streets are named after forts here that were manned by US Army outposts during the Seminole War. And it just seems like until we get people up to that level of education, we can't, it's hard to even deal with the land question. I think one of the important things that's happened, to get back to Jen's question, is that at least we've been able to begin to itemize. At least we've been able to take in Florida, or, during the regime of Andrew Jackson, the Armed Settler it's actually the Armed Settler Occupation Act, which was passed, I think, in 1832, if I'm not mistaken. So that act provides the land and the resources that sets up the first iteration of the University of Florida. And it essentially gives free land to Anglo settlers who come to Florida and pledge to serve in the white militia against Native Americans, and also pledge to serve in the slave patrols, right, to enforce slavery. And then we know later, with the passage of the Morrill Act and the land grant universities, that stolen land goes into funding universities. And now we at least have statistics, how much land was stolen to fund land grant universities. So we're beginning to put that data together, which I think could be useful in the future.
Absolutely. And I saw a particular question that was sent to me, so I'm just going to read this very quickly, if that's okay, Paul.
Yeah.
So this is from Dr. Geneva Smitherman, a person I cite heavily in the book, so I'm glad that she decided to come hang out with us. From the perspective of what if, historical speculation, can Dr. May speculate on what if Blacks and Natives had joined together in the mid-20th century Black demand for 5 states and a multi-billion-dollar settlement from the US? The RNA, the Republic of New Africa in particular, but also other activist leaders plan to take the case to the United Nations. Could such a vision have worked? And so I talk about the Republic of New Africa, which was founded in Detroit in May of 1968. And I think it's a historical conundrum, because they, in their rhetoric and discourse, use the history of the dispossession of the Cherokee Nation and the 5 tribes, and how they are saying we would not want this to happen to us, but yet they still decide to claim these 5 southern states, which was historically the Black Belt. Not going to get into the longer history, but there's a longer history about that going back to the 1930s. I think if they had a call, if we were to speculate, to say we want this particular land for Black and Native peoples. I don't think it could have worked historically, just from what I know, and I'm being teleological looking at this from what I know right now. But it would have been a much more radical vision of creating land. I mean, even someone like Paul Ortiz, which I documented in the book, tried to create a sort of Black and Indigenous town in the 18th century. It didn't really work out, but there were certain visions throughout this particular history of Afro-Indigenous relations. So, but I would like to see, there's someone, blanking of the names, and Dr. Hinson, if you have it, put in the chat, some folks I met in Seattle who are trying to actually implement this particular idea of a Black and Indigenous space for healing, for engagement. And I think we need more of that sort of activity. Right. So if there are wealthy landowners who, want to be liberal and give up the land, just find some Black and Indigenous folks and just give it up. And I'm sure we'll build the freedom dream together.
Looking down on the chat list, there's a couple more questions. I see one. Do you recommend your book to younger readers? I would have loved a more diverse and comprehensive education as a child, teen, rather than the current standard history written by the quote winners.
Yes. So when I write, I try to think of my nieces and nephews who are teenagers now. And so I sent some piece of writing and my nephew texted me back and it was like, I understood what you were saying. And it was like the greatest compliment. So if he can understand, I'm pretty sure teenagers as well, young adult teenagers can sort of vibe, especially the last chapter on popular culture, which I get into, and talking about the politics of the so-called N-word, I think would be fascinating, especially for teachers of young people. I think it would be very useful for them as well, in addition to the history stuff.
Excellent. And Bryce Henson has put in the chat bar for us, check out Gathering Roots in Seattle, and has a link to learn more about Gathering Roots. And
thank you for that.
Thank you. And then I saw another question. Oh, this is from Lim, Kyle, and Lim says, what do you recommend for settlers like myself to make an impact on issues of land back?
Well, I think one of the first things to do is know the land that you're on, wherever you're living now, and be in good relationship with the indigenous peoples who are there, right? Do not engage in the white savior complex of, I'm going to save them and do what I can. Just be in good relationships, and that could take many roads. You could take many roads to doing something like that. But often for a lot of Native people, I'm not speaking for everyone, but I'm sure over conversation over the years with white accomplices, you just want good people to be genuine. You will make mistakes, and don't worry about the mistakes. But just be in good relationships with people. That's what it is. We can be pessimistic about that, but being in good relations with people can take a lot of work too, even when you have good intentions. So that's really the best I can answer that one. Excellent.
And it looks like we have one last question. It looks to me, and then maybe Kyle, because I know you've already put in a hard day of work, and maybe we can kind of use this last question. And if you want to move towards kind of making, like an exhortation or kind of where do we go from here kind of statement. But the question is, how do you convince Caucasian people that the land in America does not really belong to them? It is the land that belongs to the Indians.
I'm skeptical. I mean, there's a lot of deep whiteness, psychosis that exists into I mean, it's so fundamental to the US culture and idea of itself that just telling white Americans that this is not your land and you're not indigenous or native to here causes like a huge storm in some people's psyche because it challenges the very notion of what they learned about US democracy, about the Constitution, about how exceptional this country is. And it forces them to take a reality. But you have to be open and willing to do that. And even someone as brilliant as Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Even said that at one point that he believed that the majority of white Americans are racist and that we really haven't understood the deep manifestations of racism in this country, in the fabric of the society. And so, especially given even all this discourse around critical race theory, that increasingly I'm becoming more and more pessimistic, if that's even possible, right? And it's difficult to see when you look at these histories and struggles. And I don't have anything positive to say about that, but people need to read more and take it seriously.
Yeah. Well, Kyle, if you wouldn't mind, I can, I just want to, plug your book again, man. And Afro-Indigenous History of the United States is really going to be a major part of convincing people to take the history seriously, to convince people that, this is a nation built on settler colonialism, and you just can't continue, people just can't continue to turn away from that. And I think getting back to one of the earlier points, I mean, I can see a young adult version of an Afro-Indigenous history of the United States coming out, in the coming years, and something, this is the kind of knowledge I think we need to get to people much, much earlier, right? And because a lot of us, especially, for me growing up Chicano, I mean, a lot of what I've had to grapple with over my life is, what we used to call back in the day, self-hatred. These constant negative perceptions of ourselves, of our behaviors, of our cultures. That's why I think that your work is so brilliant, Kyle, is that you start us in the colonial era, and you say that Indigenous and Black people built these struggles during the colonial era, during the early years of the young U.S. Republic, the long 19th century. You turn the concept of the progressive era upside down. And I don't want to do a plot spoiler, I'll just let people read the book. But you give us a completely different interpretation of big events and eras. You give us a new interpretation of so-called the Wilsonianism during World War I. You give us a different way to think about education in this country with Indigenous people and Black people at the center. You talk about boarding schools, and that's a discussion we're beginning to have, right, in Canada, in New Zealand, in the United States, in different places. So I really just want to lift up your work and really encourage people to order this book and to read it, not necessarily in the way we've been trained to read things as individuals, but to get together with a group of people, to form like a book club. I mean, during the movement days, that's what we did, or that's what we do, right? Is to get 5 or 8, or get together in your mosque, in your synagogue, in your church, in your labor union, in your club. And I just can't. I mean, I could rave about this book, Kyle, all evening, but I think we need to, at a certain point, kind of draw to a close. I hate to leave you, but I hope we're going to be seeing you in other events, in the weeks and months to come, right?
Yeah, too many to remember now, but thank you again for City Lights for hosting us, and thank you for the questions from you, Paul, and from everyone who attended the event. Very much appreciated.
All right, and Josiah, I think, brother, we'll turn it over to you.
All right. All right. Well, gracias, Paul. Everyone, please give a warm round of applause to our guests for the evening, Kyle T. Mays and Paul Ortiz. This wonderful conversation. If you have not clicked the link to buy this book, please do so now. Click it several times, get several copies, pass them around, because like Paul says, this is essential for real. And for those of you that want to see this conversation again, we're going to be posting a recording of this event on the City Lights YouTube page in a few weeks, so stay tuned for that. And if you're interested in future City Lights Lives events, por favor, go to our brand spanking new website, www.citylights.com, and check out the events coming up. Once again, gracias so much to our very special guests, Kyle T. Mays and Paul Ortiz. So much for this, for the knowledge that you all are bringing us. And gracias to the wonderful audience here with us. Hope to see you all soon in real life. Take care of each other, and City Lights loves you. Buenas noches.
Thank you, everyone.